Why do they let these old janitors talk to visitors? He probably doesn't even know what he's cleaning. The comet floated across the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's main hall, not quite a whisper, loud enough to carry. Jessica Martinez, 29, assistant museum director, was walking with a colleague, clipboard in hand, reviewing the day's staffing schedule. 30 feet away, Edward Collins was wiping down the display case housing John Glenn's Friendship 7 Mercury capsule. He heard every word. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of work that had nothing to do with mopping floors, continued their methodical cleaning. "I know," Jessica replied to her colleague, Sarah. "Ed's a nice guy, harmless really, but I've caught him chatting with visitors multiple times. Telling them stories about the exhibits. We need to remind him he's maintenance staff, not a docent." "Does he even understand what these things are?" Sarah laughed, gesturing at the priceless artifacts surrounding them. "Probably just old space junk to him." Ed's hand paused on the glass for just a moment. Inside the case, the Mercury capsule gleamed under carefully calibrated museum lights, the same capsule that had carried John Glenn into orbit in 1962, the first American to orbit Earth. Ed remembered when it was new. When the metal was being riveted together at McDonnell Aircraft. When the heat shield was being tested in furnaces hot enough to melt steel. When he and his team had run simulation after simulation to ensure it wouldn't kill the man inside. He'd been there. 29 years old, fresh out of test pilot school, assigned to the Mercury program as an engineering test pilot. But that was 1962. 63 years ago. Now he was 71, wearing blue janitorial coveralls, carrying a spray bottle and microfiber cloths, invisible to almost everyone who passed through these halls. He resumed cleaning. Steady, patient, because getting upset wouldn't change anything. And besides, he'd learned long ago that the most important work was often invisible to those who didn't know where to look. But today, someone who knew would walk through those doors, and everything would change. Edward Collins had been working at the Smithsonian for 5 years. He'd started at 66, 2 years after his wife Margaret had passed away from cancer. The house in suburban Maryland had become unbearable in its silence, too many memories, too many rooms that echoed with her absence. His NASA pension was generous. He didn't need the money. His daughter lived in California, called every week, sent pictures of the grandchildren. He could have retired, properly traveled, golfed, spent his days in comfortable leisure. But Ed had spent 50 years working. Test pilot. Engineer. Program manager. Consultant. He'd helped put 12 men on the moon. Had worked on Skylab, the space shuttle, the International Space Station. When he'd finally retired at 64, the silence had been deafening. Margaret had suggested volunteering. "You love the museum," she'd said during one of their last conversations. "Why not work there? Share what you know?" After she died, he'd applied. Not as a docent, too much attention, too many questions about his background, just janitorial. Early morning shift, 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., clean the exhibits, empty trash, mop floors. Simple, quiet. And he got to be surrounded by the machines he'd helped create. Most days were peaceful. He'd arrive before dawn, unlock his equipment closet, and spend 8 hours moving through the galleries like a ghost. Tourists would flow around him, barely noticing the old man with the mop and bucket. Sometimes, like this morning, his invisibility stung. Later that morning, Ed was cleaning the Apollo 11 gallery when he noticed a young boy standing transfixed before the lunar module replica. The child was maybe 8, small for his age, wearing thick glasses and a faded NASA t-shirt that hung past his knees. The boy's lips were moving, mouthing words. Ed edged closer and heard him quietly reciting, "Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Ed smiled. He couldn't help himself. "You know your Apollo history." The boy jumped, startled, then grinned. "It's my favorite. Do you know about Apollo 11? "A little bit," Ed said, his eyes twinkling. "Did you know," the boy spoke rapid fire, his enthusiasm spilling over, "that the Eagle only had like 25 seconds of fuel left when it landed? And Neil Armstrong had to fly it manually because the computer was taking them to a crater full of boulders?" "I did know that," Ed said. "Armstrong was a tremendous pilot, the best I ever." "Ed." Jessica Martinez's voice cracked across the gallery like a whip. She strode toward them, her face tight with irritation. The boy's mother, who'd been on her phone nearby, looked up in alarm. "Ed, what did we discuss?" Jessica's voice was carefully controlled but cold. You were chatting with guests." Again. She turned to the mother with a professional smile. "I apologize, ma'am. Our maintenance staff sometimes forget their boundaries." The mother grabbed her son's hand, pulling him away. The boy looked back at Ed, confused and sad. Jessica waited until they were out of earshot, then turned to Ed. This is the 4th time this month. What part of don't engage with visitors is unclear? The boy had a question. We have educated docents for questions. You're here to clean. She paused, her voice softening slightly but remaining firm. Look, Ed, I know you're passionate about space, but you're not qualified to provide information. You could say something incorrect and damage the museum's reputation. Do you understand? Ed looked at her. Really looked at her. She was young, earnest, genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. She saw an old janitor who probably watched too many documentaries and thought he was an expert. She had no idea who she was talking to. I understand, Ed said quietly. Good. Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then back at Ed. Just stick to your job description, okay? We need you focused on maintenance. She walked away, already absorbed in her phone. Ed returned to his cart, picked up his mop, and continued working. But across the gallery, someone had been watching the entire exchange. Someone who'd come to the museum that morning specifically to see the Apollo exhibits. Someone who recognized Ed's face from old NASA photographs. Commander Robert Bob Sullivan, retired NASA flight director, 76 years old, stood frozen in disbelief, because he knew exactly who the old janitor was. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed because of your job? Has someone assumed you didn't know anything because of the uniform you wore? Keep that feeling in mind. Because what happens next shows why you should never, ever judge someone by their current position. Bob Sullivan approached slowly, his mind racing. He'd worked at NASA for 40 years. He'd been in mission control for dozens of missions. He'd trained astronauts, managed programs, made decisions that affected billions in funding and countless lives. And he knew the legends. The people whose names were whispered with reverence in NASA's halls. The unsung heroes who'd made the impossible possible. Edward Collins was one of those names. Ed? Bob's voice was tentative. Ed Collins? Ed turned from his cleaning cart. He saw an elderly man in khakis and a polo shirt, a NASA veteran pin on his collar, eyes sharp with intelligence and recognition. Yes, Ed said carefully. Bob Sullivan. I was a flight director. Apollo-Soyuz, early shuttle missions. He extended his hand. Did you work for NASA? Ed shook his hand. His grip was still firm despite his age. Long time ago. Which program? Ed hesitated. He'd kept this quiet for 5 years. But something in Bob's eyes, respect, genuine curiosity, made him answer honestly. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, little bit of Skylab. Bob's eyes widened. You're that Ed Collins, test pilot, engineering specialist. You flew the lunar module simulator. You helped design the emergency escape procedures for... That was a long time ago, Ed interrupted gently, glancing around. The gallery was filling with tourists. This is my job now. Bob looked at the janitorial uniform, the mop and bucket, then back at Ed's face. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Because sitting at home waiting to die isn't living, Ed said simply. My wife passed. House got too quiet. I needed to be useful. And I wanted to be around this. He gestured at the spacecraft surrounding them. The things I helped build, the dreams we made real. Does anyone here know? No. And I'd prefer it stay that way. But across the gallery, Jessica had noticed the old janitor talking to another visitor. She was walking toward them, her expression already hardening. Bob saw her coming. I think your boss is about to give you trouble. Story of my week, Ed said with a small smile. Jessica arrived. Ed. I just told you. She stopped, noticing Bob's NASA pin, his bearing. I apologize, sir. Is our staff member bothering you? Bothering me? Bob's voice was ice. Do you have any idea who this man is? Jessica blinked. He's one of our janitors. His name, Bob said, each word deliberate, is Edward Collins. And I suggest you Google that name. Right now. Jessica's face showed confusion transitioning to irritation. Sir, I appreciate your interest, but... Google it, Bob repeated. Edward Collins, NASA, Apollo program. Jessica pulled out her phone, more to placate this insistent visitor than from genuine belief. She typed. Waited. Her screen filled with results. Her face went pale. Edward M. Collins, she read aloud, her voice faltering. NASA test pilot and engineer, 1960, 2010, Mercury program participant. Apollo lunar module testing. Space shuttle development. Recipient of. She looked up, her phone trembling slightly. The NASA Distinguished Service Medal. The Congressional Space Medal of Honor. Bob nodded. The Congressional Space Medal of Honor is given to astronauts for extraordinary achievement. Ed got his for saving the Apollo 13 mission. I didn't, Jessica started. Apollo 13, Bob continued, his voice growing stronger. When the oxygen tank exploded, the crew was dying. They had to shut down the command module and move into the lunar module, a spacecraft designed for 2 people for 2 days. But they needed it for 3 people for 4 days. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were incompatible. The crew was going to suffocate. He pointed at Ed. Ed was the engineer who figured out how to build an adapter using only materials on board. Duct tape, cardboard, plastic bags, and a sock. He talked the crew through building it. It saved their lives. And he did it in less than 4 hours. Jessica's hand was over her mouth. Other visitors had gathered, listening. After that, Bob continued, Ed worked on nearly every major NASA program for 5 decades. He trained astronauts. He improved spacecraft designs. When we had problems nobody could solve, we called Ed. Because if Ed Collins couldn't fix it, it couldn't be fixed. He turned to Jessica. And you've been telling him to just mop floors and stay quiet. A crowd had formed. Tourists with phones out, recording. Museum staff emerging from offices. The young boy from earlier had returned with his mother, standing at the edge of the crowd. Jessica stood frozen, her carefully maintained professional composure crumbling. Mr. Collins. I didn't know. I'm so sorry, You never said anything. You never asked, Ed said gently, without malice. You saw a janitor. That's what I am. It's honest work. But you're a hero, Jessica said, her voice cracking. You saved Apollo 13. You helped put men on the moon. Why didn't you tell us? Ed set down his spray bottle. Looked around at the exhibits, the Mercury capsule he'd helped test, the Apollo module he'd helped design, the shuttle tiles he'd helped improve. Because I didn't do it for recognition, he said quietly. I did it because it needed doing, just like mopping floors needs doing. Just like helping a young boy understand why the moon landing matters needs doing. He turned to the boy who was staring at him with massive eyes. Every job has dignity, Ed said, speaking to the child but addressing everyone. The janitor who keeps this place clean so you can learn that matters. The docent who shares knowledge that matters. The engineer who solves an impossible problem that matters. They're all service. And service is never something to be ashamed of. Bob stepped forward. Ed, why are you really here? With your reputation, you could consult, teach, write books. Ed smiled, sad and warm. My wife died 5 years ago. Margaret, we were married 46 years. She loved this museum, loved watching kids discover space. Before she passed, she made me promise not to stop living, not to stop serving. His voice grew quieter. This job lets me be around the things we built together because she was part of it too, supporting me through every late night, every failed test, every success. And sometimes I get to see a child's eyes light up when they look at the lunar module. Sometimes I get to answer their questions. And that's enough. The gallery was silent except for quiet crying. The boy broke free from his mother and ran to Ed, hugging him. You're the coolest person I've ever met, he whispered. Ed hugged him back. Keep asking questions, son. That's how we got to the moon. People who asked, what if? Jessica wiped her eyes. She'd spent 3 years managing this museum with ruthless efficiency, enforcing protocols, maintaining standards. She'd seen Ed as a liability, an old man who couldn't follow simple rules. Now she saw him as he truly was, a living piece of the history she'd sworn to preserve. Mr. Collins, she said, her voice formal but respectful. Would you be willing to give a talk? Share your experiences? We have a speaker series. No, Ed said gently but firmly. That's not why I'm here. But people need to hear your story. People need to learn from the exhibits, that's enough. He picked up his mop. Now, if you'll excuse me, the Skylab section needs cleaning. Bob Sullivan laughed. Ed, you stubborn bastard, fine. But I'm taking you to lunch. And you're going to tell me every story I never heard. Deal, Ed said with a grin. As the crowd dispersed, Jessica stood alone, watching Ed push his cart toward the next gallery. She made a decision. She approached quietly. Mr. Collins, I owe you an apology. A real one. I judged you. I dismissed you. I treated you like you were invisible. And I'm sorry. Ed stopped, turned to face her. Apology accepted, but learn from it. Every person who works here, every guard, every cashier, every janitor, they all have stories. Don't assume you know someone's value by their job title. Jessica nodded. Can I ask, why didn't you at least tell us? We would have celebrated you. Because, Ed said, I didn't want to be celebrated. I wanted to be useful. There's a difference. 3 months later, a small plaque appeared next to the Apollo 13 command module exhibit. It read, "The crew of Apollo 13 survived due to the ingenuity of countless engineers on the ground." Among them was Edward M. Collins, who designed the carbon dioxide scrubber adapter that saved 3 lives. Mr. Collins continues to serve this museum and the cause of space exploration. Ed had tried to get them to remove it. They'd refused. Now on his morning rounds, he'd occasionally find visitors standing by the plaque, then watching him clean nearby, realization dawning on their faces. Some would approach, ask questions. Martinez became a different kind of director. She learned every staff member's name, their stories, their dreams. She discovered the security guard was a published poet. The gift shop cashier had a PhD in astrophysics. The IT technician had worked on satellite systems for the Air Force. Everyone had a story. She'd just never bothered to ask. And Ed? He kept mopping floors, kept cleaning display cases, kept being useful. Because service he'd learned across 5 decades wasn't about glory. It was about showing up, doing the work, making things a little better. Whether you were building a spaceship or mopping a floor, if you did it with care, it mattered. That was enough. Edward Collins's story reminds us that extraordinary people are everywhere. Serving coffee, driving buses, cleaning buildings, stocking shelves. The person you dismissed today might have changed the world yesterday. The janitor might have saved lives. The cashier might have a doctorate. The security guard might be a hero. If the story moved you, like this video. Share with anyone who works in service, anyone who's been judged by their job, anyone who needs a reminder that all work has dignity.